It's a day like any other, in a city like any other, full of perfectly normal people. The world is a normal place, and people go about their daily lives in a regular, non-threatening way. Ruko lives her life like any other girl would, and though the bitter cold of winter is on its way, Ruko is happy. She's content with life she has, and if she were offered a second chance at life, or some kind of magical girl contract, she'd probably refuse. Then one day, something happens to Ruko. Something that will change everything. Wixoss is a Japan-exclusive card game, comparable in playstyle to something like Magic the Gathering. If you've ever played Magic before, you'll probably get used to playing Wixoss pretty quickly, provided you can get your hands on the cards. And let me be the first to say that actually playing the game is a lot of fun. The game was launched by Takara Tomy in Japan in April of 2014, and was designed as a collaboration between Takara Tomy, JC Staff, and Warner Bros. Japan, with the actual story behind the game being that you take on the role of one selected by the cards, a selector, if you will. Together with what's referred to as an L-rig, you battle against other selectors to be the very best like no one ever was, and to have exactly one wish granted at the hands of a magical deity who is responsible for the game's creation. But there's a catch. It's around this point that I imagine a lot of you are questioning what the point of all this is. Why I began by talking about a typical Japanese high schooler named Ruko, and what that has to do with the card game that is mentioned by name in the title of this video. The answer is simple. The occurrence which changed Ruko's life. The event which would turn her once normal life into a waking nightmare. That event was the discovery of this very game. You see, dear viewer, there's much more to this story than it first meets the eye. And there's a deeper commentary to be found in what many would simply consider a 12-episode advertisement for a card game. So what is it then? What exactly happens in Wixoss's tie-in anime that makes it worth watching, or even hunting down cards and playing for yourself? What is there to say about such a simple concept as, be careful what you wish for, that is yet to be said? Well, friends, I'm Octo, and today in my corner we take a deep dive into a show you likely haven't seen, but one which has a lot more to offer than a first glance might lead you to believe. Today in my corner, a deep dive into the psychological nightmare that is Selector, infected Wixoss. Welcome aboard.
I'm gonna beat the living crap out of you! We didn't know what would happen if we lost! The worst are disappearing! You just wanted to see me suffer, didn't you? Oh, and I bet you enjoyed it!
In order to understand what makes Selector such a unique and interesting series, you'll also need to understand what the story is on a base level. To that end, there will be spoilers in this video, though there will also be spoiler warnings before they happen, for the sake of convenience and worry-free viewing. In addition, the series contains story elements that some viewers may find disturbing, potentially deeply so. If you aren't the kind of person who enjoys dark storytelling, horror, or anything of that nature, you probably won't want to watch the series or this video. All of that said, let's begin. This, as previously mentioned, is Ruko. Ruko's a bit of a loner, and since she transferred high schools recently, she hasn't exactly had an easy time making friends. That's okay with her, though. After all, she has a sweet grandmother to take care of both her and her older brother. Beneath her moe appearance, though, something's missing. Though Ruko is content, there's been something bothering her, presumably for quite some time. L-Rig, the team of animators at JC Staff who adapted the card game into an anime, put a lot of extra effort into the subtle movements and animations that help us learn more about these characters, even when they aren't speaking, which is the first sign that something is very different about this show as opposed to most other card game anime you've seen. The backgrounds are also telling. Their dull, washed-out watercolor aesthetic would usually bring a sense of magical wonder and awe to a series, a pastel look that provides a narrative warmth and calm to the setting of a show. But here, color director Yukiko Ito uses it to achieve the complete opposite effect. Washed out colors and a dependence on cloudy or dull skies gives the impression of a bitter cold, the kind of empty frost that we try to ignore as we go about our daily lives, but that still manages to chill us every moment we remain away from the comforting heat of the indoor world. It's fitting, given that the story takes place in winter, but it's also interesting that this typically pastel style is being used not to provide an atmosphere of filling warmth, but of hollow cold. In a way, this art direction is indicative of the atmosphere of the entire show, because it immediately sets up for the viewer a two-sided coin mentality. On the one hand, it's pastel watercolor, which is associated in a lot of minds with innocence and youth, but on the other, it's being used to create a bleak and dreary scenario, one that wouldn't be realized at first glance. This is the way that Wixoss series is in general, with the most prominent feature in these stories being the darkness that lies behind a generic or even child-friendly looking curtain. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We were talking about Ruko. The first time we see her, she stops on her way home to look at a building which is under construction, and the visuals tell us the building will soon become an apartment complex. Clearly distraught, Ruko displays an expression which is almost fearful as she turns and quickly escapes our view to the left. Based on just these few moments, we can immediately infer that Ruko isn't exactly a people person, if the mere sight of a coming apartment building causes her such distress that she feels the need to turn and run from it. When Ruko arrives home, an immediate contrast is displayed. The outside world is cold and dreary, but Ruko's home is bright, cheerful, and welcoming. The light-hearted interactions between Ruko, her grandmother, and her older brother help us to feel immediately comfortable with this setting, which is important because it enhances the impact of a moment later on. This scene also justifies the negative reaction to the apartment building scene from just a moment ago, as Ruko losing a bet on what the building would become, an office building or an apartment building. As Ruko and Grandma talk on the balcony, the conversation topic tells us the family has a love for gaming, with Grandma even remarking that the building looks like an incomplete Tetris board.
They're only one building away from a Tetris.
All of this goes toward two things, in a narrative sense. First, it helps the viewer understand that above everything else, Ruko has a positive relationship with her family and is genuinely happy with her life. Second, it sets up the viewer to be accepting of the introduction of the actual game around which the series will revolve, that game of course being Wixoss. It isn't until that night when Ruko is walking to the convenience store with her brother that she learns that her grandmother is actually quite worried about her. Ayumu tells her that her lack of friends is worrying to Grandma, and that he thought maybe she could try to play games with others to try and expand her horizons a bit more and to prevent Grandma from worrying so much. In reality, these worries are minimal in nature, and most people wouldn't give them too much extra thought, but because of how small Ruko's support group is, and because of some spoilers we'll get into later on, Ruko becomes visibly saddened by what she perceives as a burden she is placing on her grandmother. This is when Ayumu gives Ruko a starter pack for Wixoss. He says that a bunch of other girls at his workplace have been talking about the game, and that it might be good for her to try it out at school. Ruko reluctantly agrees, and later that night curiously opens up the pack to see what this Wixoss thing is really all about. Earlier I made a statement about the impact of a certain scene being enhanced by the warm comfort of Ruko's home, and if you were wondering about what I meant by that, well, we've finally come back around to it now. As Ruko reads the rules of the game, we learn that unlike in a game such as Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering, each deck is controlled by a single creature, known as an L-Rig, but when Ruko discovers the actual L-Rig card, her curiosity quickly turns to fear when the card actually speaks to her. This is an important event, not only because it means the series proper is finally ready to begin, but also because it represents an intrusion of the game into the area in which Ruko feels most comfortable and protected from the outside world, that being her home. It's immediately apparent that Ruko is the only person who can actually hear the card, and aside from a single remark, Ruko learns pretty quickly to keep quiet about the fact that she can hear voices coming out of the card game.
Wait, you don't hear that voice?
What voice?
Almost immediately, Ruko locks the card in her dresser and goes to sleep, most likely in an effort to erase what just happened from her mind and reclaim a sense of normalcy. But of course, that doesn't happen, because as I'm sure you already suspected, Wixoss isn't just a card game, and this isn't an ordinary deck of cards. Moreover, as it turns out, Ruko isn't an ordinary person either. That night, Ruko dreams of a building completing the Tetris board, and a monster which will destroy everything in the city. It terrifies her. The next day, Ruko discovers the card is still very much alive, and as one would do in this situation, she takes the deck to school with her, despite her suspicions that it was the card which caused her to experience the horrible dream. It becomes very clear very fast that although a lot of other people in school also participate in Wixoss, nobody else has a card that can talk, and for that reason, Ruko remains hesitant to attempt to interact with the other girls. That is, until she is tracked down by a certain player by the name of Yuzuki, a player who, surprisingly, can not only hear Ruko's card, but also has a talking card of her very own, and who almost immediately challenges Ruko to a Wixoss battle. And this is where things get interesting. This girl, as stated, is called Yuzuki, and she has more of a selfish motivation for challenging Ruko to a battle than you might think on a first viewing, but we'll return to that in just a bit. As was stated, her L-rig speaks too, but almost immediately there's a difference between the two. While Yuzuki's L-rig is capable of complete sentences, and hers actually has a name,
Her name's Hanayo. Now, on guard!
Ruko's L-rig is much more primitive, speaking instead with a sort of childish intonation, and seemingly unable to form complex sentences, although it is implied that at the very least she understands most of what Ruko says to her, even if she can't respond in your typical way.
Battle bomb!
All of this is to say, or rather to point out, that what we're meant to take away from the comparison of the two L-rigs and their respective selectors is that Ruko and Yuzuki are not the same. And it's at this point that a suspicion that perhaps Ruko is an irregularity compared to the other selectors begins to form. It's also at this point that we get an explanation in terms of what this game actually is. To put it in basic terms, within the Wixoss card game is a form of magic, for lack of a better term. Most players will enjoy the game normally, and never actually experience talking L-rigs or any other bizarre phenomena. However, there are some players, known amongst themselves as selectors, who fall under the proper conditions to be chosen, or selected, if you will, by the game. These selectors play by completely different rules and occupy completely different roles. You see, their purpose is to compete with one another, in elaborate battles constructed with the purpose of allowing them power to become what's called an eternal girl, also known as a deity, with the power to make wishes come true. If you've never seen the show before and my explanation has you confused, the SparkNotes version is that if you're a selector and you win enough battles, your one true wish, or rather the power to make your one true wish come true, will be yours. So far so typical, right? Wrong. Because while in most other shows tackling this subject matter would be something that is treated as a good thing, here, it's instead used as a means of raising the stakes. Again, I'll explain what I mean by that in more detail later on, but for now let's quickly go over what happens if you lose, since we'll be returning to it later. I often see this series compared to Yu-Gi-Oh!, mostly on the basis of a paranormal card game being at the center of both shows, but what makes Selector different is that there isn't actually a Shadow Realm to be banished to, at least not as a penalty for losing. Instead, as Hanayo explains,
if you lose 3 battles, you also lose your right to be a selector.
Your L-rig will be taken from you, and any and all memories of the game will be erased, permanently. If you ever play Wixoss again, it will be as a trading card game, not a potentially wish-granting tournament of wit. There are some other consequences too, but again, we'll get to that. For now, let's return to Yuzuki, and why she's introducing Ruko to the game and offering her a quote-unquote friendly battle. It isn't because she's just that super kind best friend/mentor character that usually exists in these kind of shows to show our main character the ropes. It's because Ruko is an easy target. If your ability to grant your wish is to be revoked after 3 losses, and you'll presumably never be given the opportunity again, losing suddenly feels like a bit more consequential of a thing to have happen. If the game you're playing only gives you 3 hit points, the consequence of getting hit at all feels a bit more severe. Unlike a video game though, where you can simply try it again, this game essentially uninstalls itself forever once you lose 3 times. And as if that wasn't enough to make selectors take each battle seriously on its own, there is no set number of victories to work toward, like in a typical tournament arc. So aside from a few subtle hints from your L-rig, there's no way of actually knowing how far you're progressing, or even if you're progressing at all. The only appeal of winning is the relief that you didn't lose, buried in what would be the guilt of knowing your actions have led to the destruction of another's dreams. In short, the game is designed to turn the selectors on each other, to eliminate their ability to empathize with their opponent, and to make this a game not of Shadow Realms and the heart of the cards, determined not by the results of a game, and rather to make it into a game in which all that matters is whether you win or lose. Essentially, Yuzuki is feigning kindness for an easy and almost assured victory, which is a rare occurrence for a selector, and because Yuzuki doesn't actually care about Ruko or whether or not she even has a wish to fight for, she knows that her wish is worth potentially hurting others in order to obtain. This is more or less confirmed by the way Kazuki participates with the scene, at first going along with Yuzuki's plan, but later calling Yuzuki out for luring a new player into a game in which Yuzuki had a clear advantage, and one in which Yuzuki had no intention of using for any other reason than an easy and low-risk victory.
You can hear me, right, Yuzuki? I'm sorry, but this is just wrong.
Speaking of battles, it's time to discuss how a selector battle differs from just a regular game of cards, and the rules which govern it, because this too is an integral part of the story. Whereas up until now the show has been using the aforementioned watercolor style, the battlefields, or arenas, for lack of a better term, are more akin to digital art, mixed with a sense of unease that comes from their simplistic, almost void-like design. You'll find no watercolor or pastel comforts here. Instead, very strong colors and abstract backgrounds are used to accentuate that feeling that something isn't right with this, a feeling which ultimately is completely justified. As for the actual in-universe mechanics of a selector match, the way it works is that two selectors initiate a battle when one of the two of them says aloud the word open. When this happens, the world of the two selectors is altered, and an arena is created, with the environment of the arena based solely upon the roles of the selectors who are battling within it. For example, the arena that Yuzuki and Ruko use in Ruko's first battle is completely different from the battle between Ruko and Hitoe. It's important for a pair of selectors to begin their match in such seclusion, not because they need to keep the secret of the selectors from becoming public knowledge or anything like that, although most selectors seem to keep the game a secret from non-selectors anyway, but instead to ensure that the battle is not prematurely stopped by an outside force, something we can see can and will happen just minutes after the first battle begins, when a teacher comes to the roof and reprimands the girls for playing Wixoss instead of going to class, because unfortunately, the game does not magically stop time. This is called the no gamer rule, and it's essentially only possible when someone who knows nothing about the cards or the selectors attempts to communicate with one or both of the selectors during a battle. Rather than counting as a loss for both sides, the game is simply called off, and the girls are returned to normal. It's also important for this whole scene to play out the way it does, because it not only informs us that those who know about selectors, even if they aren't selectors themselves, can observe for the most part the occurrences of a match, though they have no visual of the arena, but also that selectors are granted a form of spectator mode, which we'll see later on, but as for poor Kazuki here, he just gets to look at these two sit here and watch the cards move on their own until the match ends. Though he is able to communicate with them by speaking to them during a match,
Can you hear me?
the girls inside the arena are unable to respond to him in any way.
Whose side are you on here anyway?
For the last time, people on the outside can't hear you.
It's also important to note that the entire time they are in battle, selectors are technically vulnerable, meaning that if someone wanted to physically hurt them or steal from them, they could absolutely do it as long as they were familiar with the concept of a selector. This is why one of the biggest struggles for the series' main characters is finding a safe place to battle, where they won't be disturbed, usually leading them to pick abandoned or somewhat sketchy places. It isn't because the game necessarily needs to be kept secret, just that it's more convenient for everyone involved that way, and most people aren't too keen on bragging about the fact that they have a magical wish-granting trading card that only they can hear, and battling transports them to arenas that only they can see. The fact that most selectors end up being the kind of people who go along with this sentiment isn't coincidental either. As we know from Hanyo, selectors are the chosen ones, and as cheesy as that may sound at first, she doesn't actually mean it in the Ash Ketchum or Harry Potter sense. In this case, the fact that each selector is, well, selected, denotes that selectors are the kind of people who are desperate enough to get what they want, that they're willing to crush the hopes and dreams of the other players in order to get it. It's at this point that I feel the need to place my final spoiler warning. Up until now, I've been able to provide timestamps to avoid spoilers for people who haven't watched Selector yet, but from here on out, they are just going to be sprinkled in. So if you've decided you actually want to watch the show before continuing on, you can leave now and come back once you're done watching. Just know that this show does get incredibly disturbing with the topics it covers, and the events which take place as a result. You have been warned. want it to be made very clear that almost none of the Selectors are actually supposed to be good people. Even Ruko, who at first appears to be the only one among the Selectors who is actually guided by good morals when playing the game, is more or less treated as the villain for the majority of the show. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. At the end of class that day, Ruko asks Yuzuki if she wants to hang out, something that is clearly somewhat nerve-wracking for her given how she shows a bit more tension in her movements when she asks about it. This isn't really because Yuzuki and Ruko are actually friends, but is instead merely an action taken to pacify Ruko's grandmother and to get her to believe that Ruko does have friends after all, even if she doesn't. There is a lot more to unpack regarding the discussion that happens between them, but it isn't until the next morning that Yuzuki actually accepts Ruko as a friend by saying she no longer feels the need to battle with her. So far, the game seems like a positive change in her life, and Ruko accepts it, along with the rest of her family.
What? You were playing Wixoss until 4 a.m.?
Yeah, I showed it to my grandma and she got hooked.
Unfortunately, this is where the positive side of the game ends. You see, at the heart of Wixoss, and what makes it truly worth experiencing, is how the story handles the concepts the game is truly built around. Not wishes and friendship, but cruelty and deception. In Wixoss, we learn the most about how the game decides its player base from the Selectors themselves. While it's implied that there are multitudes out there, we only really get a look at 6 of them over the course of the first 12 episodes. Ruko and Yuzuki, whom we already know, but whom we'll discuss further anyway in a bit, Hitoe, Chiyori, Akira, and Iona. Understanding these characters, and how they connect with one another, is key to decoding the events of Wixoss, and in understanding what the show is trying to say. First and foremost, though, let's discuss Akira. Akira, much like another Selector we'll be discussing soon, is a fashion model, but isn't all that well known compared to the other one, who shall remain unnamed for now. At first glance, Akira is peppy, bubbly, the perfect example of a fashion model idol culture. Her warm demeanor and overall design give us the distinct impression that she's trustworthy and friendly. As it turns out, it's difficult for Selectors to actually find other Selectors, since only L-rigs can identify a Selector at first glance, and asking every Wixoss player on the street isn't exactly a viable option. For that reason, celebrities such as Akira openly talk about their love for the game as an attempt to draw out other Selectors, a tactic which works rather well. Meeting her before class at a completely different school building, Akira's friends insist that she's too busy to sign autographs. But when a third individual shows up and asks aloud if Akira is truly a Selector, the model is quick to lead the girls away to a secluded location where the battles can occur. This battle is our first glance at Akira's true character, and it doesn't take long for her to become, for lack of a better term, Akira is a high-level player, but the catch is that she only plays against low-risk, weak opponents. Since she doesn't care in the slightest about hurting others in order to get what she wants, her main strategy for gameplay is emotional abuse toward her opponents. Akira typically exposes the wishes of others and mocks them for what they desire, presumably because of the nature of a Selector's wish being a typical requirement for becoming one in the first place. But before we get to that, and how the battle between Akira and Hitoe turns out, we need to take a slight detour and discuss the concept of wishes as applied to the Selectors. According to the way Funimation markets the show, you'd think that the message is your typical be careful what you wish for story, and it would be that if anybody ever actually got what they wished for. Instead, the true meaning or message of the show is more along the lines of, if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. In almost every case of someone having a wish, the wholesome idea of wishing upon a card is tainted by the deep inner desires of the Selectors themselves. There are exceptions to this, 2 exceptions to be specific, but as for the other 4 characters, their wishes are not the kind of thing you'd typically see in a character in their position fight for. In the show's own terminology,
it's something I want to come true no matter what. But it's not the kind of wish someone can make happen, like with a bunch of hard work or whatever.
Let's start with Akira. Up until now, you've probably assumed, along with most of the show's audience, that Akira is a stuck-up rich little snob. But she's not. In fact, Akira isn't well off at all. Her only confidence is set squarely upon her good looks, and she simultaneously wants to be a part of and has a hatred for celebrity culture. In a cruel twist, she parodies the catchphrases of movie stars or famous celebrities by coining the term "Ocky-lucky," which she uses exclusively when she discovers a means of causing misfortune towards others, or finds a way to enact cruelty upon them. This is because Akira suffers from an inferiority complex, specifically toward rival model and fellow selector Iona, the unnamed individual from earlier. Akira's wish, then, is not simply to become a popular model, but to destroy Iona's career, taking the spotlight from Iona completely and spending the rest of her life rubbing it in Iona's face. It makes perfect sense, then, that Akira seeks out and violently crushes lower-level players just as a way of making herself appear more threatening as an adversary. She thrives off of the power she gains from playing, but it's that exact power that leads to her downfall. Over time, Iona's success continues to eat away at Akira, and she comes to rely solely upon the game, thinking that if only she can win enough battles, all of the time she spends on Wixoss instead of modeling will be justified, and she will have what she believes is rightfully hers: superiority. Of course, the irony here is that it's precisely because Akira devotes her life to the cards that her dream becomes an impossibility. Akira loses her job even before losing 3 battles due to her obsession with the game, and in an act of desperation as a result, she challenges Iona to a selector battle in the parking lot after Iona finishes up a photoshoot that Akira believes is rightfully hers. But then, that just begs the question. If Akira is this unstable and desperate, why is she settling it with a children's card game instead of, well, the more obvious answer? And the answer to that question is pretty simple once you stop and think about it. In all honesty, the stakes are higher when you're playing Wixoss. And the reasoning behind that lies in the simple idea that in Wixoss, the point of the game is not to play a game. It's to enact cruelty upon your opponent. To make them watch, helplessly, as you destroy their dreams and move toward your own simultaneously. That is the kind of pain that Akira went through. And that is the kind of pain she wants Iona to go through. You see, when you lose 3 times, your right to being a selector is revoked. But as Hanayo explains after Hitoe loses 3 battles and things start getting way worse than anyone expected, not only do you lose your dream, but it becomes tainted. And as of the moment of the loss, unachievable. Hanayo's example of this is the best one, so I'll just let the show tell you itself what I mean by this.
If your wish was to be an expert pianist, you wouldn't just lose your piano. Something would happen that would prevent you from playing ever again. Something to ensure your wish could never come true.
When this revelation happens, everything changes. All of a sudden, settling it with cards becomes a lot more emotionally charged, and Akira's decision to challenge Iona to Wixoss instead of, say, beating her within an inch of her life and leaving her on the road to die, is that with the cards, she can effectively destroy Iona's right to a happy life and the ability to accomplish her goals. She can destroy Iona herself, make her miserable, make her suffer. And the best part is, there will never be so much as a shred of evidence to prove that it was even Akira's fault in the first place. So yes, in this case, cards are a much more satisfying way to resolve the conflict, because in a dark twist, it's the cards that caused the most damage. This is how Wixoss is really played, and why it's a requirement that a selector's wish fall under a certain category. In case you still haven't figured it out yet, that category is none other than the wish's capacity to cause suffering, to either the selector themselves or to those around them. Oh, and that comment about losing all memory of the game from earlier? Well, even that has fine print. Because, to put it bluntly, Wixoss is a game of deception and cruelty. It was created with that express purpose in mind, and it will continue to accomplish its goal and create continuous suffering for its players until the deity that created it can be put to rest. And before you ask, yes, there is a reason for that, but we'll get to that later. For now, back to Miss Ocky-lucky.
Oh god, make me cringe.
Obviously, Iona destroys Akira, and because she also lost a match with Ruko earlier on in the series, Akira has now lost her access to the game permanently. Her memories, however, while not fully intact as per the rules of the game, have left her with pieces of what happened. And if you still think it's dumb that these characters fight with cards instead of bullets, let me remind you of a little something. Guns are kind of difficult to obtain in Japan, especially for high school students who are completely off their hinges. Would you like to guess what's easier to get a hold of? Knives. And yes, when it comes right down to it, you can't exactly solve everything with a card game, now can you? Akira actually hunts Yuzuki and Ruko down, threatening to carve them up and leave them ugly, like her. And while she's after them both, her biggest real target is Ruko. You see, Ruko hurt Akira with her victory. After Akira wiped the floor with Hitoe and then used Yuzuki's wish as a means to torment her and gain a second victory, Ruko had had enough of Akira's toxic attitude and threatened to never forgive her, and Akira, of course, responded accordingly.
You must think super highly of yourself, huh? I can't live if Ruru won't forgive me.
The problem was, Ruko is different from other selectors. Unlike Akira, Hitoe, Iona, Chiori, or Yuzuki, Ruko has no wish. She fights as a selector because her Elrig and her enjoy battling, but as the series goes on and Ruko learns of the hardship her victories are causing to others, she chooses not to engage in battle. And when she tells Akira she won't show her any mercy, Ruko is prepared to destroy her, which is exactly what happens. It's this embarrassing loss that kickstarts Akira's downward spiral, and it distresses Akira to such a degree that she speaks a line that has become almost synonymous with Wixoss anime. When Ruko tries to say that she only wanted to get back at Akira for bullying her friends, Akira retorts by saying this.
You just wanted to see me suffer, didn't you? Oh, and I bet you enjoyed it!
This is where it becomes strikingly clear what the problem with Ruko is, and why Iona tells Ruko that participating as a selector without having a wish is more than just wrong. It's blasphemous. Because she doesn't have anything to lose, but her opponents arguably have everything to lose. Ruko is a dangerous breed of selector. She has the power to cause suffering, but is immune to receiving it, because even if she lost, she had no desperation to be granted a wish in the first place. I often hear her compared to Madoka from Puella Magi Madoka Magica for this reason, because both are given abnormal amounts of power and both have very little to lose, making them dangerous to the others around them. And I would say that's a valid point, though calling the series a mix of Yu-Gi-Oh! And Madoka Magica like you see all the time is a blatant mislabeling of what the series sets out to achieve and the kind of story it's trying to tell, in my opinion anyway. To conclude, Ruko and her Elrig, which she gives the name Tama, are irregularities. Why would the game choose Ruko when she can participate unaffected? Why choose someone whose suffering is minimized and who is unfazed by the true deception of the game? The answer is simple, because Ruko wasn't meant to be chosen. The game didn't choose her. She just happened to be the person who found Tama, and Tama just happens to be something of an irregularity herself. Then we have Hitoe, a girl whose potential for loss is her reason for being a selector. As a naive and lonely girl, Hitoe wishes for friendship, and in her case, never has to win a battle at all in order to achieve it. Though she loses twice relatively early on, she chooses to keep her Elrig, Midoriko, around as a good luck charm, since she believes the game is responsible for her newfound friendship with Ruko and Yuzuki in the aftermath of the Akira battle incident. Despite Midoriko's repeated warnings to throw the cards away and quit before a third loss occurs, Hitoe is eventually found by a terribly strong opponent, presumably Iona, and loses for the third time. Though we've already discussed what this meant for Akira, what it means for Hitoe is actually our first experience with the cruelty of the game. True to Hanayo's words, not only does she lose her memory of the game, but also loses her memory of her friendship with Ruko and Yuzuki. The words vanish from her diary, right before her eyes, but as with the abilities that come from being a selector in the first place, this is something that seems to affect her exclusively, as her mother is still able to see what's written in her journal. That should have been enough on its own, but as an added punishment for her failures as a selector, if someone who has even the potential to become her friend goes anywhere near her, she is assaulted by violent bursts of unbearable pain. Hitoe's mother is understandably very concerned about what has become of her daughter, and when she meets up with Ruko to try and find out what occurred, all Ruko can do is respond by saying that there's nothing she can do about it now, and that they didn't realize what would happen if they lost. Unfortunately, though expectedly, Hitoe's mother doesn't understand Ruko's words. It's a tragic but well-executed moment that really sets in the stakes of Wixoss, because now, it's more than a game. Now, we know for sure there were consequences. Then there's Chiori and her Elwig, Eldora. Chiori is an interesting character because even though she's incredibly important, she starts out with the least amount of depth out of all of them. Essentially, Chiori's dream is to become an Eternal Girl, but beyond that, she doesn't really care what happens to her or what the consequences of actually becoming an Eternal Girl would be. Somehow, she's a fan of Selector, and she seemingly knows more about the whole system than anybody else. She already knows the stakes, but somehow, be it through sheer childish naivety, or a simple misunderstanding of what is going to happen to her once she actually gets it, Chiori still loves the game.
Fare thee well, Selector! Yup!
When she confronts Ruko and Yuzuki, she comes off as annoying and stupid, for lack of a better term, but this is exactly what makes her introduction work. As an audience, we now know perfectly well the true nature of the game, and seeing someone be so excited about a game that she clearly knows very little about puts us right back into the shoes of Ruko at the beginning of the series, when all she cared about was having a good time battling with her friends. Chiori was where we were when this whole thing began, and that is what makes the game so fascinating. It's all fun and games after all, until someone is irreversibly hurt. Chiori has a much bigger role to play in all this. Well, okay. Maybe not a massive role to play, but she has more to do in the plot, but I'm choosing to save that for when we discuss Season 2. Much like Ruko though, since Chiori's only wish is to become an Eternal Girl, the consequences for losing aren't really that high. It's just that she'll never be able to do it, and her skills as a Wixoss player will always be terrible, which comparatively is not at all the worst thing that could happen to a person. Then there's the one I've been avoiding talking about, Yuzuki. Okay, hey everybody, Octo here. So as I was editing footage for this video, I realized that I misspoke a few times in this last section, which is a bit of a problem because re-recording all of that would like really suck. So instead, I found a pretty nifty solution. Pretty proud of it. But yeah, all this is just to say that in this next section, toward the end here, there's gonna be one or two moments where I had to splice some audio together to fix the fact that I misspoke and didn't want to re-record the whole thing. So, yeah, just letting you know that that's going to be a thing. Okay, cool. Yuzuki's wish is wrong. I need to make that as clear as I possibly can. It's a twisted, gross desire. But that ironically makes it perfect for a series like this. When Yuzuki talks about her wish with Ruko, she never actually says what it is out loud, and though it's heavily implied by the way she interacts with a certain other character, it isn't actually revealed until Yuzuki battles Akira.
That's immoral.
As we discussed earlier, Akira uses what Yuzuki's wish is as a means to torment her, but finding out about Yuzuki's wish is almost as bad as the fact that she's getting tormented over it. The fact of the matter is, the show has given Yuzuki the kind of desire that could only be given to her with the power of the game. The only real way to discuss this is bluntly, so that's what I'm going to do here. Just so we are absolutely clear on this, Yuzuki's wish is for her brother to love her. Not regular sibling style love her, but to love her as a romantic partner. She knows it's wrong, but it's still what she wants, and apparently has been since she was in preschool, and potentially even before that. Now, I'd like to point out that the show does not condone this. It's what this character wants, but it's never actually touted as being something that is worth wanting. Instead, as something which is used as a means of accomplishing the goal of the game, to cause suffering and to deceive. And suffering it does cause, because despite witnessing the tragedy of Hitoe, and now knowing how difficult attaining Eternal Girl status can be, Yuzuki pushes forward with her dream anyway, and that begins to make things happen. See, Kazuki is supportive of his sister. Very much so, but he's still very much within the realm of brotherly norms, if that's a term. However, as the game continues, and Yuzuki relies on Hanayo more and more, Kazuki changes. It isn't ever blatantly mentioned or called attention to, but my theory to explain this is that his mind and his actions are being altered by Yuzuki's wish, and by the power of her Selector abilities, as well as that of her Elrig. For example, when the show starts, Kazuki is implied to be
popular with the ladies, including the one
who works at the card shop with him, something Yuzuki dislikes, and the reasoning behind her indifference to the card store in general.
But that means we'd have to go to the card shop.
Yeah, unless that's a problem.
But you'll notice, over time, Kazuki starts to become oddly obsessed with being close to Yuzuki. There is no canon confirmation of this, but I believe what this means is that Kazuki's mind is being altered, if not controlled, by the game, even if he doesn't realize it. All of a sudden, he's become exactly the kind of fantasy version of himself that Yuzuki wanted him to be, the version who wants nothing more than to be hers and hers alone. It makes you wonder how much control Kazuki really has over himself by the time the show's end occurs. Of course, whether or not he's the same person at the end of the show as he is in the beginning is up to interpretation, but there's a subtle horror here, a terror wrapped in the idea that someone else's twisted and perverse fantasies about a person could be given the power to take hold over that person and mold them into someone they're not. Especially when you consider how unlikely it is that Kazuki would be so willing as he is to
reject the girl who asks him out
and get with his sister instead. I have to admit, I'm only really speaking for myself here, but I can't see an actual human being choosing to do this unless some form of psychological control was at play, and it is absolutely horrific. But then, that's operating under the assumption that Yuzuki is the same person by the end as she was when the show starts, and unlike with Kazuki, we have a very concrete answer to that question. You see, after Yuzuki becomes an Eternal Girl at the end of the series, a very specific set of things happen. First, the oath of the Eternal Girl is spoken.
And upon this sacred oath, a new Eternal Girl shall be born!
Second, Yuzuki is taken away to another plane of existence and given the power of an Eternal Girl, the power of an L-Rig. Third, Yuzuki's body is given to Hanayo, and she no longer lives in the card. This is what it means to be given the power to make your wish come true. This is what it means to be given the power of eternity. You live forever in the form of a card, as an Eternal Girl, while your L-Rig lives on, and eventually perishes, all the while existing within your body. In essence, once you've become an Eternal Girl, you will never have the life you once lived again. Your body will no longer be yours, and your wish, and whether or not it comes true, is dependent on the life your L-Rig chooses, because now, after all the deceit and all of the suffering, this is what a wish's true price has turned out to be. What Selector is trying to say with this story isn't that you should be careful what you wish for, or even that you shouldn't bet on things you know shouldn't happen. Though I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking that upon first glance. No, the truth is much more simple than any of that. The truth is, dreams, and whether they come true, if not determined by hard work, are the kinds of dreams that can hurt. Anything you have to fight for is going to be painful at some point, but if you're desperate enough to hurt others to get what you want, then perhaps your lot is to be hurt as well. This horrid cycle, this suffering, which only begets suffering, it must be brought to an end. Only then will these corrupt and hateful wishes be destroyed. Only then will the true Eternal Girl, creator of the game, be laid to rest. Hey guys, thank you for watching another Octo's Corner Deep Dive. Believe it or not, there's actually a lot more to talk about with this series, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, that's all the time I have to talk about it today. Rest assured though, Part 2 is on the way. If you liked this and you want to be notified when more Wixoss content comes out, or just more Octo in general, then you can click subscribe and hopefully never miss an update from myself and my buddy MissingLettr. If you want more Octo content, then you can click the link down below and visit Octo's Corner playlist, and hey, from my little corner of the internet to yours, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.